Good evening and welcome to our program tonight on behalf of the Lectures Committee and the Department of Journalism. I've been asked to make an announcement before we begin tonight's program. So I'd like to tell everybody that Senator Dick Clark will be speaking, what day is it? Okay, Friday from 11:30 to 12:30 in the sunroom, and you're asked to bring your own lunch, a sack lunch, or you can pick something up in the Union, and he will be speaking on the American policy towards South Africa. Well, tonight, of course, you've come to hear Wilfred Burchett speak, but we happen to have a surprise guest also, so I'd like to briefly introduce him and say a few words, and then he will introduce our main speaker, Wilfred Burchett. Erwin Silber here is the executive editor of The Guardian, and The Guardian is an independent radical news weekly which is published in New York, and this is the paper for which Wilfred Burchett writes exclusively in North America. And if you're not familiar with The Guardian, tonight will give you an opportunity to become so, and we have some complimentary copies at the back table in the room if you would like to pick one up. We have a limited number, but if you'd like to pick one up on your way out tonight, feel free to do so. There are also some subscription blanks, and I definitely think it's worthwhile at least looking at, one issue. Also, we have some copies of a couple of the books that Wilfred Burchett has written, and they will be available for sale at the end of the meeting tonight. They're also on that back table, and he has said that he would be very happy to autograph them. So if you'd like to pick up a book and get it autographed by him, we'll take care of that at the end of the discussion. When the talk is over, we'd be glad to take questions. And I think now I'll just have Erwin Silber get up and say a few words and then introduce Wilfred Burchett.
Thank you. Wilfred Burchett right now is on his first United States speaking tour. This isn't the first time he's been to the United States, but it's the first time that he's been to the United States and been given the permission of our State Department to speak in public. This may sound like a somewhat ordinary or routine matter, but in the case of friend Wilfred here, it has, like everything else in his life, not been routine. And the last time he was in the States, he was confined to a 25-mile radius of New York City under the assumption, we assume, that anything terrible or subversive that could happen in this country has already happened within a 25-mile radius of New York City. But that we dare not send him beyond those confines. However, what this says about the change in the political climate or the change in consciousness outside of New York City, I'm not sure. Anyway, Wilfred can now speak beyond the Hudson River. You're here, and we have to assume that you've heard something about Wilfred Burchett. But I would like to take just a couple of minutes and give you some of his background, because, as you know, we journalists are overwhelmingly modest and do not like to speak about ourselves much. We were in Minneapolis last night, and just before our meeting began, I just happened to overhear a young man come up to Wilfred and say he'd been reading his articles for some period of time, and he said, I have to say, I think you're really a very unusual, a remarkable Australian, which is probably true.
We've always Harry Bridges.
Well, okay, that makes two of you. But Wilfred is also a remarkable journalist. And I say that not simply because he's been on the spot and gotten his share of beats in news stories, because there are many very competent journalists throughout the world, including the English-speaking world. But Wilfred is a remarkable journalist, not solely in the sense of what he has written, because The craft of journalism is a lot more than the story you write. The craft, the art of journalism really is knowing what the important story is. And if there is one thing that characterizes the work of Wilfrid Burchett over the last 25 years, it has been an understanding, his deep conviction, which we who put out The Guardian share, that the most important story of our time is the story of people's struggles for national liberation and independence. And there are many good journalists who somehow have missed that story. But ever since the end of World War II, and I should say before that time, Wilfrid was a war correspondent, served with the U.S. fleet in the various island hopping operations, covered the Burma-China theater of the war, and so on. But after the conclusion of World War II, as the nature of the events of the modern world unfolded, from Korea to Indochina to Southern Africa, it was Wilfrid's deep understanding that this was the real story of our time, that this is what's changing the course of history, that brought him to the various places where he could write his stories from. And so when it came to covering Korea, in particular the armistice negotiations, and most of the Western journalists, all of the Western journalists, let's put it that way, relied for their news on the briefings handed out by what was then euphemistically called, and still called, the United Nations Command. Wilfrid Burchett covered that story from the other side. He was stationed at Panmunjom and came to be known by the journalists of the West as their single best source of information, certainly as compared to the handouts that were given by that so-called United Nations Command. The Western journalists found very quickly that they weren't getting the real story. From Panmunjom to the Geneva Conference on Indochina, and as Wilfrid points out, before he would even cover the peace conference on Indochina, he went into Vietnam himself to see for himself what that story was, where he met Ho Chi Minh and was involved with the coverage of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. On to the Bandung Conference, and once again, Indochina, starting in the early 60s, perhaps the most illustrious chapter in an illustrious career, where for some 10 years, the real story of the Indochina War came to the Western world primarily through the reportage of Wilfrid Burchett. We of The Guardian, of course, are very proud that in the United States that reportage appeared in our newspaper, making of those reports in our newspaper not just the source of information for people to know what was going on, but a basis for people's understanding of the nature of that war, and therefore a direct connection with the political movement that grew in this country in opposition to the Vietnam War. And his instincts have led him, since that time, unerringly, to the current foremost battlefront of national liberation and anti-imperialist struggle, and that is Southern Africa, where he has been to Angola and Mozambique any number of times and has provided, once again, the story of national liberation and struggle for independence from the point of view of those engaging in the struggle. That's the kind of journalistic career that Wilfrid Burchett has pursued. If you read his books and you have followed his writings, you will know that he is a man who has exhibited great personal courage. He's covered guerrilla wars as the guerrillas lived them and fought them, in the tunnels, in the underground tunnels in Vietnam, in the jungles, and so on. But there's more than personal heroics involved. There is a political courage, the courage to call the shots as you see them, the courage to go against the tide of conventional wisdom, usually the tide of conventional wisdom that has come from the West, but even at times the conventional wisdom that has come from those with whom Wilfrid is nominally allied. What's happening? Are we already being taped? Oh, we are being taped, I see. I knew it had a familiar sound to it. Well, I think that's why you have come tonight, to hear from Wilfred Burchett the observations he's had, has today, on the foremost political liberation struggle of our epoch, the struggle for national liberation, particularly as it is unfolding today in Southern Africa. Wilfred Burchett.
Well, first of all, thank you, Erwin, and thank you all for coming along this evening. Well, I think that it would be no surprise for you that I would now be interested in Southern Africa, because that's where the center of the storm of national liberation has shifted. I'd followed primarily the struggles for national liberation, independence in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, until fairly recently. But there's no question that now the center has shifted from Southeast Asia to Southern Africa. And that's why last year I was 3 times in Angola and twice in Mozambique. And also I covered the Geneva non-conference, one could say, on Zimbabwe, which took place at the end of last year. One thing which surprised me very much when I visited and discussed with the leaders in Angola and Mozambique was the extent to which they had followed the struggle in Vietnam. Not only followed, but the extent to which they had studied the methods, the combination of military and political warfare, military and political strategies and tactics, but also the actual techniques of guerrilla warfare, which certainly the Vietnamese carried to an unprecedented level. And I might say that once I was in Bandung for the 10th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, and there I met Zhou Enlai, and he knew I'd just returned from one of my visits to the liberated zones. He immediately took me aside and said, "Tell me, how are they doing it in Vietnam?" And I told him some of the episodes which I'd personally seen, been involved in, and he said, we thought that we took guerrilla warfare to a certain level of perfection, but our Vietnamese friends have taken it to a level which we never even dreamed of. Anyway, the methods used and the approach, which was always to mobilize the maximum unity of the people, to mobilize the maximum of people who could be mobilized around a correct sort of political line. This is one of the very original features of the Vietnamese struggle. What has been typical and rather moving in Africa has been the extent of sort of inter-African solidarity, which cut right across racial, ideological barriers, as the torch was sort of liberation, national liberation struggle was carried from one country to another, from, one could say, from Cairo towards the Cape, and it's now approaching quite close to the Cape. And this took very practical forms. Once Nasser had consolidated the independence of Egypt, he immediately offered, for instance, hospitality and training facilities for the Algerian National Liberation Front. And once a provisional government in exile, Algerian provisional government in exile, was set up, it was also immediately offered facilities, hospitality in Cairo, and many other African national liberation movements had also could have set up their headquarters, established missions, diplomatic missions in Cairo. Even though these were movements which were, from an ideological point of view, perhaps political point of view, were not at all in line with the point of view of President Nasser. And then as the Algerians developed their struggle for national liberation, even before they had won their independence, they offered training facilities alongside their own guerrilla fighters for those of some of the Portuguese colonies from Angola, for instance, and there were Angolan military cadres fighting alongside the Algerians in the sort of latter stages of the Algerian national liberation struggle. And as soon as Algeria gained its independence, immediately it opened its doors wide for many other national liberation movements, including those of the three Portuguese colonies, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique, also many others. And they were able to establish diplomatic missions there, they were able to have training facilities, and as the struggle later developed in the three Portuguese colonies, Algeria was very generous in providing all sorts of assistance, including actual arms and equipment. And so it went on. When Tanzania got its independence from the British, immediately they offered base facilities for Frelimo, the national liberation movement of Mozambique. And Tanzania offered transit facilities, very important, vitally important for the MPLA in Angola, to use the territory of Tanzania to transport arms across to their movement. And it's gone on like this. In Angola, as soon as Angola consolidated its independence, immediately, within a few weeks, there were missions from the African National Congress of South Africa, the leading body struggling for independence there, and also for SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, which directs the struggle in Namibia. The same with Mozambique. Mozambique, even during the latter stages of its armed struggle, before they had actually won their battle against the Portuguese, they were already cooperating with the Zimbabwean liberation fighters, especially the ZANU faction, the Zimbabwe National African Union, and they were actually fighting alongside each other, and they didn't know who was going to win first, and they had a sort of a pact between the General Tongagaru, who's the head of the armed forces in Zimbabwe at that time, and Samora Machel. They had a sort of a pact of, if I win first, you can be sure that our territory will be your base for operations in your own country. And from the Zimbabwe side, if we win first, you can be absolutely certain that you will have bases in our territory for the liberation of your own country. As I say, this cut right across racial and ideological boundaries, and one can be absolutely certain that when Zimbabwe wins its independence, and when Namibia wins its independence, as they certainly will do, I'm convinced of that, in a relatively short time, then Zimbabwe and Namibia will become bases for the final phase of the struggle of national liberation in South Africa against the last stronghold of racism and fascism in South Africa itself. I think one has to understand that national liberation leaders are very responsible people, and they don't go in for armed struggle just for the sake of violence. They're very responsible people towards their leaders, towards their own people, and if they decide to launch armed struggle, it's because that's the only way that is open to them, and it means that they have exploited all other possible avenues of gaining their aims, which is the I suppose, the highest expression of human rights, which is the national independence of a country, of a people. And I might cite the case of the country which I'm best acquainted with, and that is Vietnam. It was in June 1919 when Ho Chi Minh first presented proposals for the independence of Vietnam at the Versailles Conference in 1919. Ho Chi Minh presented an 8-point proposal to the leaders of the West European countries, of course, including France, who were discussing the end of the war and the peace treaty. He first presented very moderate proposals for independence for Vietnam within the framework of more or less the French Commonwealth, the French Union. Of course, these were rejected contemptuously by the French, and from that time on, Ho Chi Minh worked with just one aim in mind, and that was to get independence for Vietnam. He slowly organized, built up organizations inside the country, among Vietnamese outside the country, and it was not until 25 years later, having exhausted all possible means of persuading the French to be reasonable about this question, it was not till 25 years later that the first shots were fired in Vietnam. And this was the same with if we take the example of the Portuguese colonies. But the reply always to agitation for independence, for peaceful demonstrations to independence, was always that these demonstrations were always put down in bloodbaths, one can say. And there's the example in 1959 in Guinea-Bissau, or earlier than that, in actually the first really big event of that sort which took place was in Luanda in March of 1959, when there was a completely peaceful demonstration at which tracts were handed out suggesting that Angola should also have its independence, as with many of the British and the French colonies in Black Africa. And that demonstration was just put down. The militia came up and just simply opened fire, killed scores of people, wounded hundreds of others. And that marked a watershed for the leaders of the independence movement. They started thinking that there is only one way. And a few months later in Bissau, at the docks in Bissau, in Guinea-Bissau, it was the same thing. There was a dock workers' strike, but that strike turned into it started over economic demands, but it turned into a political type of strike where the workers started demanding also independence. The same thing happened. The militia and the police moved up and opened fire, and dozens of people were killed and many others wounded. But the greatest massacre at that time was early in 1960 in Mozambique, and it occurred at a place called Mueda in northern Mozambique, across the frontier from Tanzania. And there'd been several delegations from groups of exiles, Mozambique exiles in Tanzania. They had the idea, well, all the other colonies in Africa are getting their independence, why not ours? And they sent delegations across the border to see the provincial governor with some very, very modest sort of demands. Reduce the taxes and stop the forced export of labor to the South African gold mines, and a few things like, so that we exiles can come back and take part in the economic, political life of the country. And after several delegations were not received, or they simply disappeared, they were arrested, and there was the governor of the province invited them to come and present their demands, and he would receive them. They were invited to send up their spokesman to see the governor, and to the great astonishment of the crowd, the spokesman came out handcuffed and were hustled off into jeeps to be taken to the local prison. Well, there was a melee. There was a riot. They tried to, the local people
Told us that if we went over 55 miles an hour on the highway, we'd get a ticket.
And the governor
Now,
had
suppose they
their
had said
troops
the
concealed
speed
all
limit is
around
55, but if you disobey it, you're not
provincial
patriotic. And we're going to take a look at you and say you can't wear the flag in your lapel.
600 people killed.
They'd be going 75 everywhere.
And, well,
You
it
know
was
I'm telling the
after
truth.
that.
Why is it
That was
that when the color question comes up, all of a sudden,
climax.
we get paranoid and schizophrenic and try to pretend that we
each
can't
of the
have
three
goals
colonies,
and
they
timetables.
decided there's only
The
one road,
reason that we had them was
we
to
have to
bring
go back
into
to,
the mainstream of
violence
American life
with
those who had been by law and custom
it was
kept
about
out of the
the same
mainstream.
time,
This is a goal that we all ought to be able,
1960,
if we are
June
really
1960,
patriotic American citizens, to be in
when the
favor of. Now let me deal
Sharpeville
just with the Barker
massacre
case.
occurred in
I
South
hope it won't
Africa.
take too long. I know you're going to
Now,
have a
the
panel on it, but there's
Sharpeville
some
massacre
facts
has
that you
gone
very
into
seldom
history,
read in our
often referred to,
newspapers. You don't
but,
hear it on television. You don't get it on radio.
In general, I don't
What
think
was
it's
the
generally
problem?
known what really
In
happened at
1968,
Sharpeville and what was the cause of
In this
Sharpeville.
great, noble
Sharpeville
country of
was
ours,
the,
there were
was an
close to
example of the
9,000
maximum,
people admitted to
devotion to
first year medical
nonviolence.
school.
It was a
close to
completely
9,000.
non-violent Gandhian
Of
type
that number,
demonstration
less
against
than
the
200,
pass laws,
about
what was called the
275 were
those are
black,
the pass laws.
and about
And so all Africans
8,600
had to
white.
carry a pass and produce
This
it.
country looked at
So
that
they were
and said, it's
they were
not,
asked
it's,
to. They didn't
it
have
just
it with
can't
them.
work
That
that
was a capital,
22,
a
25
criminal
million
offense.
black folk
And the pass
are
in the
knocking on the
past, they had
doors,
to establish
and we
that
won't let
they
them in.
lived in
And
the
I want you
place
to
where they were
understand that
born,
this was
that
not
the
just a
residential
custom in
thing
the,
was
the
the
law
place
in the
where they were
South.
born.
It was a custom in the
They
North.
did it for 10
Whether
years,
Harvard or
at least,
Yale,
minimum of 10 years,
University of
the same
Chicago, or the great
employer.
state schools of our nation,
had to be
black
the
folks simply
signature
were
of
not
the
admitted.
employer
They
for
didn't talk
every
about
month,
qualifications. They just didn't let you in.
to,
That is a historic
justify
and
that.
historic fact that can be
They
documented.
had to show that they had paid all their taxes.
And so we started affirmative
A whole
action.
lot of other
In
humiliating
1976,
things.
affirmative action had succeeded, special
elements
admissions
in this,
programs in having an
degrading
entering law medical school
system which they could be pulled out at any
population of
moment, anywhere,
close to
anytime,
1,400
and,
blacks.
they didn't
We
have their
thought
pass,
and think
or there
that's
was a
marvelous
signature
progress. And let me
missing,
tell you
or
something else.
taxes
All
not
of them
been
were
paid,
qualified.
automatically into jail,
The
beaten
people are coming up now
up,
this whole
nobody knew
jive
they would come
about
out again.
best qualified.
So the
Nobody can define best qualified. If we could define best
Pan-African
qualified,
Congress people
there wouldn't have been a
decided to
best
have a non-violent
selling book written on the
demonstration.
Peter
That's
principle
really
that says
typical.
all of us have been promoted to the
Gandhi
level of our
type,
incompetence,
the
and now we
influence of
stop
Gandhi, of course,
and
was
kill
very
everything above us and
strong
get
in
mad
South
because we
Africa
don't go
because of the
further.
strong,
And the Peter
Indian
principle is
community
alive and
there.
well all over America.
The idea was to
Now,
march
But
all
remember
over
something
South
else,
Africa, march to local
that in
police stations without
1976,
pass,
not only
and simply say,
did we
"Here
have
we are,
1,400
we
blacks
haven't got passes,
in medical
please arrest
school
us."
first-year admission classes,
And they,
but the number
the
of
idea was
whites
that,
in 1976 had
the numbers
risen
involved,
from
it would
about
be absolutely
8,600
impossible
to
for
almost
the
14,800, a
to
a
arrest
percentage
them.
increase of
the
49%.
leader of the
So
leader
I
of the
don't
Pan-African
believe it's
Congress
fair to say
was
that
the
black
first
folk are
to
getting
go
all the
to
spots that whites ought to have. If
present
they can go
themselves
from
to the
8,600 to
Johannesburg police
14,900, then it seems to me if they want the rest of them, they not only want the cake, they want all the crumbs that would fall from the table. And there's some of us who are standing and saying it shall not happen. This nation must finally redeem the promise that it made when it said that all of us were created equal, and we're standing at the NAACP at the gates to guard the fact that we want all of us included in and none of us included out. The other thing that you don't,
just roaring down just over there.
the other thing that you don't read too often,
Level.
and I want you to mark this down and I can prove it,
You can imagine this.
that in 1973, the year
And
that
they
Mr. Barkey
started-
applied for the Davis
there was
Medical
a
School,
riot. They started
and was
stoning
denied.
or something like that.
there were
Using whatever
36
weapons they had
white
against,
students
the police, and probably tried
who
to
were
throw
admitted in
stones
that
to
class of
planes.
100 who
But
had
they
lower
apparently just
academic averages than Mr. Barkey.
And then the
I'm
police
sure you didn't hear
opened
me.
fire, and there was
I said there were
67 people, officially
36
67
whites who were
people
admitted
killed.
who had
There was
lower
32 of them on 52
academic
of them,
averages
and
than
those
Mr.
almost
Barkey, and that's
all
a
had
matter of
been shot
stipulated
in the
record
back,
in the California
as
Superior
was
Court.
the case
But Mr. Barkey did not seek
vastly
to
greater
get one of
scale
those 36
at,
spots.
Soweto.
He came against one of the 16 that had
15
gone
years
to
later.
minorities. I know
But this
this
also
great and noble
was
nation
a-
is not
a
saying to us that it's all right for a white man to be admitted with a lower grade, but not a single black shall pass. I don't believe that this nation is saying that to us. They also don't tell you that there were 20 whites who had higher benchmark averages than Mr. Barker, who were not admitted. Now, there's a difference between academic scores and benchmark scores. I need not spend a lot of time with that at a great college campus like this, but the academic average is only one part of the criteria which is used.
From that time on,
the benchmark is a total concept of all the tests, all of the kind of admissions criteria which is used. So Mr. Barker was number 20 on the waiting list because there were 20 whites who were higher than he, and they don't talk about that. Nor do they like to talk about the fact that the dean of the Davis Medical College stipulated that in addition to the 16 seats which were set aside for disadvantaged, which historically had gone to minorities, that he had 5 in his hip pocket that he gave out as he saw fit. And when questioned about who got those 5, he said, well, I usually reserve them for the sons and daughters of alumni or wealthy people who had given us at least $50,000, or for the sons and daughters of the legislators in the California legislature who could favorably influence legislation. But Mr. Barker did not seek one of those 5 seats, but he came after the 16. Nor do they talk about the fact that in this great nation of ours today, there's one white doctor for every 800 white people, and one black doctor for every 3,800 black people. Nor do they talk about the fact that even though black people constitute 11% of the population of this nation, that we constitute less than 2% of the medical doctors. Nor do they talk about the fact that of all the black doctors and dentists practicing in America today, 90% of them, even after 10 years of affirmative action, are graduates of only 2 schools, and that's Meharry and Howard, predominantly black. And there are 116 medical schools in this country and 54 dental schools, and between them, they've only managed to produce 10% of the black doctors who practice, and that ain't discrimination, if that's not segregation, if that's not looking at the problem through eyes of color, then somebody needs to give me a new mind. I feel like that. I feel like that. I feel like that boxer about the 7th round who was bleeding from every pore, and he got back into the corner, and his handler said, he hadn't laid a glove on you yet. Get on in there and really fight. And the boxer looked at the blood running down. He said, well, listen. If he hadn't hit me, somebody better watch that referee because somebody's pounding hell out of me. And I understand that Davis Medical School is a new facility, and there are a lot of our friends who tell us that what we ought to do is get more places. Well, we've expanded. The Davis Medical School went from 50 to 100 in order to bring in some minorities. They don't talk about the fact that Mr. Barker was turned down in 11 other medical schools that year, and one of them was his own alma mater, the University of Minnesota, where supposedly they knew him best. And you see it said over and over again that the only reason that he wasn't admitted was because he was white. But the fact is, one of those 11 medical schools that did not admit him did not admit a single black in that year. Now, why did he miss out in that school?
Well, if they could do this in the
they don't talk about the fact
why can't we do it?
That the University of California Medical School at Los Angeles was in existence for 50 years, from 1920 until 1970, before they graduated their first black doctor.
There were always groups within the
color was a problem. Not the way we smelled or the way we looked, not because we didn't have the brains to achieve or the capacity to make it, but because we were black, they told us to stay back. And if color were the cause of the problem, there's no way from the top side of heaven to the bottom side of hell to solve it without taking color into consideration. And we shall insist that somehow or the other we redress that.
In South Africa. And I think it was Amilcar Cabral who was the founder leader of the PAIGC, the Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde Islands. After these massacres, he summed up the position in a way which I think it's difficult to disagree, considering what had taken place. He said, just referring to these various massacres, it's obvious from all the facts that violence is the essential means of imperialist domination. If we accept the principle that national liberation equals revolution and is not simply a matter of raising a flag or singing an anthem, we shall find that there can be no national liberation without the use of liberating violence on the part of the national forces, in answer to criminal violence of those who promote imperialism. Nobody can question the fact that imperialist domination, no matter what its local characteristics may be, implies a state of permanent violence against the nationalist forces. Well, Cabral himself, shortly after he wrote that, was a victim of violence. He was assassinated by the Portuguese Gestapo, by the PIDE. And anybody who's really followed these struggles, who's followed independence movements in various parts of the world, in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa, knows that this was a correct summing up. That is the only, that was and is the only way for peoples, especially when they are ruled by really fascist, racist type of regimes such as exist today in Rhodesia and in Zimbabwe. There's been a good deal of talk recently about an Anglo-American plan for Zimbabwe, of negotiations in the United Nations for the independence of Namibia, and of various types of pressure being applied to the Vorster regime in South Africa to abandon this his atrocious policy of apartheid and racial discrimination and oppression and so forth. In my talks with the leaders of the ANC and of Zimbabwe and Namibia, they simply don't believe that these things are going to have any effect. They don't believe in a negotiated settlement in Zimbabwe. They don't believe that Vorster is going to abandon and get out of Namibia. He's already said he might, but in any case he will retain Walfish Bay, the main port, Namibia's main port. Well, this is unacceptable to the SWAPO. They know to leave even one bit of territory in the hands of the South Africans is to build up, the South African regime is to build up problems for the future. I attended the Geneva conference on the future of Zimbabwe, and it was clear in the very first days that Smith had no intention of abdicating power in favor of a true one-man, one-vote system. And I attended. Smith left after the first 4 or 5 days, saying, "I have, more important things to do," which meant he had to press on with the business of suppressing the guerrilla movement. But I attended the press conference with Peter van der Buhl, who is the foreign minister of Smith, and we asked, well, what is your position? Do you believe in majority rule or not? He said, yes, we believe in majority rule. Great. Now, does majority rule mean one man, one vote? No. When we speak of majority rule, we mean responsible majority rule. And in that press conference took place in a Geneva hotel, and right alongside the press conference room there was literature, official government literature of the Rhodesian regime, or Rhodesian government, where you could find out what really means responsible majority rule. And I'm quoting absolutely directly from an official government pamphlet. First of all, to get on the electoral rolls, at the time the Geneva conference ended at least, some things may have been modified since in discussions, but I haven't heard of it. But to get on the electoral rolls, Europeans, Coloreds, and Asians must prove that they earned an annual average of the Rhodesian equivalent of $2,700 and something, and must own property worth not less than $5,500, and have completed not less than 4 years secondary education. Well, these are obvious, very simple qualifications for any of the Europeans to comply with. not so simple for the coloreds. The coloreds refer, I'm using their term, they refer to Europeans, coloreds, and Asians. The coloreds mean people of mixed race. The Africans must prove that they earned an annual average of $924, owned property worth $848, and had completed not less than 2 years secondary education of, in inverted commas, prescribed standards. Now, those qualifications are almost impossible for, anyway, 90% of the Africans. And the proviso of prescribed standards meant to eliminate any Africans who might have got 2 years secondary education at the missionary schools, because the missionary schools tended to avoid racial discrimination. Some of them, many of them, anyway. And so this would provide for the elimination of any who had 2 years of secondary education at a non-approved missionary school. And the House of Assembly, and that's the case as of still of today, consisted of 66 members, 50 Europeans to represent their 260,000 of the population, and 16 Africans to represent their 6 million of the population. And even then, only 8 of the 16 Africans were directly elected. The others were elected by some sort of an electoral college set up by chiefs and headmen appointed by themselves appointed by the Smith regime. So this is Smith's idea of responsible majority rule. Some of these conditions may have been whittled away in the various negotiations that have gone on with the British and perhaps even with Kissinger's discussions and so forth. But essentially, that's the sort of situation which the black Zimbabweans are being invited to accept. There was an incident at Geneva which I think reveals also very much the nature of the Smith regime. The Patriotic Front, a Patriotic Front was set up just before the Geneva Conference started, formed by a fusion of the two main nationalist bodies, the ZAPU and the ZANU, the Zimbabwean, the two main organizations. And some of the ZANU leaders came directly to Geneva from Zambia, from jails in Zambia. It's too long to go into all that, but it was a very complicated situation, and most of the ZANU leadership had been arrested by President Kenneth Kaunda's government in Zambia and put in jail, and they were released only by pressure from Tanzania and Mozambique and so forth, so they could come to the Geneva Conference. And they realized within the first week or so that this was simply a waste of time, that nothing could possibly emerge from that conference, given the attitude of Smith and his foreign minister he left behind to head the delegation. And they wanted to break off the talks and go back. They said, you know, what are our comrades be thinking of us? Here we are, they're on the battlefield, they're dying, they're suffering, and here we are living in luxury hotels for nothing, getting nowhere. And they demanded permission from the rest of their organization to break off the talks and go straight back to the battlefield. And but the leadership of the delegation, especially of the leadership of the movement, especially those who were actually at the battlefront, said, no, we must not take the responsibility of breaking off the negotiations. Let the other side do that. We are really for a negotiated settlement. We are for a peaceful solution, and we shouldn't take the initiative in breaking off the talks. So what they did, they sent some of the leadership directly from the battlefield to come to Geneva and reassure and reinforce the unity and the unity between the two factions, show the solidarity of the Patriotic Front, and support their negotiating delegation. Well, this included the top leadership of the ZANU faction of the Patriotic Front, including 6 of their field commanders, their ZIPA, Zimbabwean People's Army field commanders, and 3 other top leaders. They arrived quite late at night on the night of December 3rd, 1976, and they were almost all wiped out within a few hours by a fire which mysteriously broke out in the room of the head of that delegation and very quickly swept through. He escaped by a miracle. It started at 4 o'clock in the morning. They'd all arrived exhausted, obviously a long, long trip. They were all fast asleep. But some instinct woke the Corps Direction Gongo, who was the deputy leader of the ZIPA, and he dashed out through the flames and smoke, left everything behind, and managed to alert the others and get them out of the flames. Just roared through the whole floor of that of their hotel. I was there just a few days afterwards and saw the whole floor was completely gutted, and of course it could have been an accident, but it was rather too much of a coincidence. You had for the first time, you had the whole of their leadership there in one place, assembled in one place. Some had come from as I say, the jails from Zambia, others from the battlefront and from Mozambique, and they were absolutely convinced, and they put out a communique a few hours later that was arson, and it was an attempt to destroy their entire delegation, their entire leadership. And those are the sort of things which go on. Well, the essence of the so-called, or the much discussed and much publicized Anglo-American plan for settling the question of Zimbabwe, of settling the question of majority rule, of independence, is really based on the Kissinger Plan, which provides in essence for what they call the so-called moderates, but would leave effective power during a transitional period in the hands of the present security forces. The alternative, that was the Kissinger Plan, that the present security forces, that is the Smith's army and police force, should maintain power during a transitional period, but with a proviso in the Kissinger Plan that if the transitional plan didn't work, and if a majority rule was not installed by a certain time, the Smith regime would continue to function. It would be be put on ice, put in a refrigerator for a couple of years, but if nothing was worked out by that time, they would come back into power. The new plan is somewhat different, calling for the British to play a role, to take over control of the army and police forces, and with the United Nations forces to play a role, to come in as sort of a peacekeeping force. But this is unacceptable to the Zimbabwean nationalists, because it means they must lay down their arms. And no national liberation movement in that sort of situation where they are would ever agree to laying down their arms. And especially after the experience of what happened under the United Nations flag in Korea and the Belgian Congo and so forth, this is unacceptable. And this is probably the main stumbling block at present. And the armed struggle from their point of view is going very well. They started from under very difficult conditions. They started from sort of just one front in a perimeter area. Gradually, as the Frelimo succeeded in its struggle against the Portuguese and liberated its territory, they gradually opened up other fronts. And and operated almost in all the perimeter areas, and then started advancing towards the more central parts of the country. They don't have anything yet which they call liberated zones, as existed in Vietnam. They explained if we declare a liberated zone, then what will happen will be what happened in Vietnam. These would be declared free fire zones where the planes would come and bomb and strafe and at will and cause great damage and suffering. But they have what they call semi-liberated zones. And these are zones where the Patriotic Front has the administration, the entire administration is theirs. The Smiths forces can come only by parachuting them in and getting helicoptered out. They can make raids into the territory. All the roads are denied in those areas to the Smith regime, and that's what they call, they've given the name of semi-liberated zones to those areas. And those zones are being expanded here, there, not in any sort of, it's not some sort of gradual closing in on Salisbury, but moving a bit here, moving a bit there, moving a bit there. And they seem very confident that the armed struggle is going quite well. And there's a new element in the armed struggle there now, and that is the employment of white mercenaries, including American mercenaries, veterans from Vietnam. There's very active recruiting of mercenaries going on in England, in my own country, in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, and Smith is counting a good deal on the mercenaries to replace the young men of Rhodesia who are finding all sorts of pretexts to get out, and a lot of them also going to Australia. Australian mercenaries are coming to take their places, and lots of Rhodesians are going as far away from Africa as possible. First of all, they started to go to South Africa, but they've decided the situation there is not very promising, so they prefer to go a little further afield. I asked the leaders of the Patriotic Front, I asked them separately, Nkomo, Joshua Nkomo, Robert Mugabe, and Machinguru, one of the political leaders, about these stories of atrocities they were supposed to have committed against missionaries and against women and children and so on and so forth. And that was at Geneva because there'd been a report that the guerrillas had killed 3 missionaries. Well, they each told me that this is absolutely impossible. That in general, they have very good relations with the missionaries of different denominations, and they explained that Smith has a special commando organization called the Sailor Scouts, who paint their faces black and so forth and wear the sort of nondescript uniform worn by the guerrillas, and these people go in and commit atrocities. And first of all, to kill people who they know have been friendly to the guerrillas, and then at the same time discredit the guerrillas. And I must say there was rather good implicit confirmation of that just shortly after I'd discussed this question with them. And you probably remember that there was an Irish Catholic bishop, Donald Lamont, who was arrested and sentenced to 10 years jail in Rhodesia for having refused to disclose the presence of guerrillas on his bishopric in his area. And not only that, but having advised other missionaries and clergymen to do the same, to refuse to do that. So this is, anyway, implicit confirmation that there were good, correct relations. And I spoke to Garfield Todd, who was a former Prime Minister of Rhodesia. And is almost a fellow countryman of mine. He's a New Zealander. He was a former prime minister who was sort of kicked out because he had advocated steps towards majority rule. And he was kicked out, not only kicked out, but he lived in forced residence until only about 1 year ago. For about 10 years, he'd been forced to live on his farm and never move out, he and his daughter and his family. And he assured me that the relationships with whites who had anything like a normal attitude, and normal relations with the black population, that there was no problems whatsoever. There was no friction, there were no problems, and that they lived in quite good harmony. So I believe, I don't believe in these atrocity reports. They keep coming out, and there are always some horrifying details. That some baby the other day was supposed to have been speared to death and things like this. I don't believe in these things, and the impression that I got from my talks with the leaders, I believe that what they said was the truth. Well, regarding Namibia, I had to ask, put the question to Sam Nujoma why they had decided to go over to armed struggle. And well, he gave me a long list of their frustrations, of all the efforts they had made to have a peaceful solution of the problem in Namibia. He gave me a list of the resolutions which had been passed in the United Nations during about the past 10 years. All very good resolutions demanding that South Africa quit and hand over power to the people of Namibia. If you remember, Namibia, Southwest Africa it goes right back to the League of Nations days when it was was given to South Africa as a mandated territory with a specific time limit for the mandate. Well, that's expired decades ago. And he said that there simply was no other way left. They had exhausted everything. None of those United Nations resolutions had ever been implemented. South Africa just simply scorned them. And it was significant that I met him actually in Luanda. He just set up a mission for SWAPO. The first time I met him was just shortly after the MPLA government in Luanda had consolidated its position. And thank you, I'm getting dry. Later, I met the head of their mission, who had just come from the frontline areas, a leader called Homatini Kaloenja, who was in charge of their mission in Luanda and in charge of training guerrillas for Namibia, and I suppose in charge of military operations in that area. Well, I asked him what were their tactics, what were they aiming to do at the moment in their armed struggle. And he said, well, for the moment we're not concentrating on setting up a liberated zone, on liberating territory. What we're concentrating on is keeping the South African forces off balance by making attacks on a military post here and there, and when they start moving out to defend those posts, then we catch them in ambushes. It's the traditional sort of classical beginning of guerrilla-type warfare, forcing the enemy's forces to disperse, keep them off balance, and attack their convoys, get arms, and get battlefield training at the same time. But he said that they were able to push down, really penetrate very deeply into very close to the capital, to Windhoek, the capital of Namibia. And that there was tremendous enthusiasm among the young people. They kept coming over the border and asking for guns, coming over into Angola and asking for guns and straight back into battle. Of course, they're calmed down a little bit, and it's explained to them that first of all better get some even general education and then some military training, so that when they do get guns, they can use them intelligently. I met quite a few of these young people. They come over all the time. And while I was down near the frontier areas, an entire primary school came over, all of them. And the day after that, their teacher came, because he turned up one morning and there were no kids at the classes. He knew what had happened. He suspected what had happened. And so he decided he'd better go over himself, because he'd be blamed, he'd accused, he'd be punished anyway for not having been vigilant enough. And that's happening all the time. In Angola, they have schools, they have primary schools, they have secondary schools, they have hospitals for their wounded, and they are organized. SWAPO, as far as I can understand, is very, very strong. They had a very, very strong political infrastructure throughout the whole of Namibia. And from the information I got from South Africans, from the ANC people and from the SWAPO people in both Mozambique and Angola, it's obvious that the Western press did not report at all adequately on the shock in South Africa when their forces were defeated in Angola. That this was a tremendous sort of psychological shock for the Vorster leadership and the sort of whitest elite people around him, and a source of great satisfaction to the black population. They told me that in the cinemas there was during that fighting there were documentary filmed when there were documentaries shown that if there was something showing a South African victory of South Africa, absolute silence in the cinema. Anything which showed an MPLA victory, people were applauding. It was dark after all, and they could clap without identifying themselves. And all these showing of documentaries were always sort of subjects of demonstration by the black population. This I heard also from South African journalists at Geneva, South African colleagues working for the main, establishment newspapers. But they said, you've no idea what this caused. First of all, the victories in Angola of blacks in Angola and Mozambique, that started tremendous demoralization in ruling circles in South Africa. But the defeat of that South African column in Angola, which advanced, first of all, it was a great victory. They advanced with great rapidity, but then they retreated with even greater rapidity. And I was there at that time and followed on behind, and this was a very, the extent of that defeat was probably not published much in the Western press, but they suffered very heavily. There were armored cars and artillery pieces all the way down the road, and there were quite heavy casualties, some prisoners of war taken. Well, my first discussion with the ANC people was a couple of months before the Soweto massacre. And the point they were making was that the young people, that these defeats in Angola and so forth had caused tremendous sort of enthusiasm among the young people, especially among students, among pupils, and it was a whole subject of conversation. It was sort of a really tremendous morale uplift, and also older cadres, older militants who had sort of dropped out of the struggle. They had regarded as things as sort of hopeless. They all started surfacing again and asking getting organizations put together again, and that what is happening in South Africa at this moment is a very, very intensified development of a political infrastructure on which armed struggle could be based. And in Namibia, the SWAPO people said, all right, Forster seems strong in our country at present, because there is no armed struggle in South Africa. He can concentrate, a very large part of his forces against us. The accounts vary. Some say 15 to 20,000. He gave the figures that at times there were almost between 30 and 40,000. But he said, what happens when armed struggle starts in South Africa itself? And of course, this is he won't be able to concentrate these sort of forces in our country, and he knows that. We know that, and I think that this is we'll see very, very important upsurge of military activity both in Namibia and in South Africa before very long. I noticed in today's paper that there'd been what was referred to as the biggest battle of the war in Namibia, just close to the Angolan-Namibia frontier. And actually the news came from South African sources claiming 80 guerrillas killed, for only 5 of theirs killed, but the example of Vietnam shows you can't put any faith in those sort of figures. If they had, if there were 80 guerrillas killed, which I very much doubt, then there were far more than